All right, heading into the axial skeleton, our first section we're going to look at is the skull. So that contains our 8 cranial bones and our 14 facial bones, as well as a variety pack of other things. You can see the other aspects of the axial skeleton include your auditory ossicles, so the small bones in each of your ears, your hyoid bone, which we'll mention at the end, your thoracic cage, which consists of your sternum and your ribs, and then your vertebral column. In total, that's about 80 bones, again, functioning in those ways we talked about last week, which involve protection and support for various organ cavities, as well as containing bones that have lots of markings on them, allowing for attachment and passageways. So you can see on the slide here, it kind of gives you some of that numerical breakdown in terms of numbers of bones in different locations, as well as that protective feature. So especially for our facial bones, our respiratory canal, obviously with our nasal passage, our oral canal for digestive, as well as our auditory canals are going to be involved for both cranial and facial bones. You also have various cavities. You have orbits, orbital sockets, you have a nasal cavity, you have an oral cavity, and then obviously the auditory canal. One of the first things we're going to mention, just because it shows up in your slide first, there are several sutures, those immovable joints that connect the bones of the skull in particular. And you can see the ones that your book talks about first. We're going to add a 5th one to it that's on your bones list, so make sure that you have that handy. Just taking a look, here's my skull here. Looking at our frontal bone, our first suture that I want to point out to you is the coronal suture. And that is the coronal suture that connects the frontal and the 2 parietal bones. I like to think of it as where my crown would sit, hence the name coronal. As we look down the center, all right, or essentially the midline of the skull connecting the 2 parietal bones, you have the sagittal suture. Remember, sagittal means that right and left divisions of the body. As we look on the posterior portion of the skull, here's our occipital bone. You have a lambdoid suture located there, shaped sort of like the Greek letter lambda, connecting the occipital to the 2 parietal bones. And then we go to the left or right side, and you'll have these sutures on both sides. I'm just showing you the right. You have your temporal bone here. You have your squamous suture that's connecting your temporal to your parietal. And then in the back, this is your 5th one, not mentioned on the slide, connecting your occipital bone to your temporal bone. That is called the occipital mastoid suture, and that is listed on your bones list for axial skeleton. So those sutures serve as connections between the different cranial bones, as you can see on the following slides. And then it starts listing out those bones, gives you a couple of different views of the skull, as well as some of the markings that we'll find as we make our way through. Opens up the cranial cavity so you can see into the spaces, the fossa that'll be located inside, as well as a nice top-down view. So if I were to remove the cranial cap, I can also take a peek inside and see the 3 primary fossa, allowing for my brain to sit, as well as the opening in my skull for my brain stem to then reach out and become my spinal cord. All right, a couple other structures that are not necessarily bone that we will find in the skull that are on your bones list are the sinuses. The purpose of having sinuses is to decrease the weight of your skull. They are all lined with mucous membranes, so they provide a moistening of the air as that air flows. And really, most noticeably, when our sinuses are kind of plugged up or stuffed because we're overproducing mucus, because we're trying to stop bacteria from getting into our bodies, what we end up with is an alteration in our voice, right? Sinuses serve as a resonating chamber for the air that we're pushing up when we are making sounds with our vocal cords. And so when we're sick and plugged up, it's a different kind of sealing, and so our voice sounds different. I always think of Phoebe from Friends, right? When she gets sick and she's singing Smelly Cat, and she's got that sick voice, so it sounds really great. And then she gets better and she's back to her normal voice, and so she keeps trying to get sick from people, so she gets the sexy Smelly Cat voice back. You have a couple of sinuses to identify. So you have your frontal sinuses, which are located here behind your frontal bone. You have maxillary sinuses, which are located here, all right, near your maxilla or your upper jaw. And then you have sphenoid sinuses, which are going to be located here. All right, so you have 3 groups of sinuses you're responsible for knowing. You'll be practicing those in your mastering assignment as well. All right, let's take a look at some of those cranial bones as we make our way through the skull. You can see the list there. I'm going to walk through each of those, and then the following slides are going to break them down into different parts, and you can look at those on your own time. I'm just going to zip through those slides and jump to our next section, but you can look at them on your own. So the first bone listed up there is the occipital bone. That is located in the posterior portion of your skull. So here's our skull. That's your occipital bone. That is covering the occipital lobe of your brain, which is where you see from. So technically speaking, you do have eyes in the back of your head. So you'll have that one occipital bone in the back. There are 2 markings that are associated with the occipital bone. So I'm going to flip over so we're looking at the inferior portion of the skull. And you can see here one marking that is located on the occipital bone, located here and here, is this opening here. And that is the foramen magnum. That is where the brain is going to transition into the spinal cord, leaving the skull and heading into the vertebral column. In addition to that, you have another notable marking. I'm going to remove this jaw for a second. Another notable marking here. You can see these 2 smooth surfaces that are convex, pushed out, and curved. And those are the occipital condyles. And that is what C1, your first cervical vertebra, are going to articulate with in order for me to do things like this, all right, for my skull to be able to sit on my vertebral column, right? And those 2 markings are associated with the occipital bone because all of this is occipital bone, right? Next on your list, or that's over there, you see you have a parietal bone, and you have 2 of them. You have a left and you have a right, all right, located on both sides of the head. So if you were to take your hands and place them on the sides of your head, you would have both of your hands on your 2 parietal bones. Your frontal bone sits right in the front of your skull, covering the frontal lobe of your brain. And then on either side, your left and your right, you have temporal bones, all right? So you have 2 temporal bones, and I believe we have a couple. Yes, we have a couple of markings for our temporal bone. So first, I took that jaw off, but I'm going to put it back in. One of the first markings that we have on the temporal bone that you need to know is the mandibular fossa. So this is an indenture, an indented space, a depression that allows for the mandible, the jaw, to attach into the temporal bone. So when you put your hands and open your jaw, you're able to feel where that articulation, that joint, is occurring. You also need to identify, I believe it is our zygomatic process, and that is this piece right here, all right? The zygomatic process, and that is basically an extension that is going to articulate with part of your zygomatic bone, which forms your cheekbone, all right? Together, these 2 bones articulating create an arch, and that's referred to as the zygomatic arch, just so that you are aware. You can see on your list there are several other markings that you might want to become familiar with. Your styloid process, your mastoid process, your external auditory meatus. Those are things that you might want to take a look at as well, but you are not required to, right? Last 2 are the sphenoid and the ethmoid. And actually, I am going to flip ahead, so I'm going to do a little fly by the seat of my pants situation here, and I'm going to zoom so that we can take a look at the sphenoid and the ethmoid bone. So these bones are very distinctive in shape, best seen when they are disarticulated. But as you can see there, I'm going to take off that skull cap. And as you look inside, you can see kind of a bat shape. I'll go this way. You can see kind of a bat shape. It's in green on, most of it is in green on our skull here. But you can see that. And I usually call the sphenoid the bat for obvious reasons. So you can take a look. It has literal wings, and it's got some processes that stick out. It also, the shape of it creates one of our sinuses, those sphenoid sinuses that are located in that region of the skull. All right, so creating those air pockets as well. The next bone that you have that has kind of a very interesting appearance is called the ethmoid bone. Again, something that's seen a little bit more clearly when we are when it's disarticulated. In our skull here, you can see it in a little bit of yellow up here, just anterior to the sphenoid bone. But I'm going to flip it around. I call the ethmoid bone the bug. It reminds me of a little bug here with its eyes and a long proboscis, and then these big poofy sections on either side, which are part of the nasal concha. Basically, these little pockets of air that form, pockets of bone that form part of our nasal passageway. And it has a lot of aerated open space, again, to allow for that filtration of air being near our respiratory passage. You can also see these bones when looking through the orbital sockets. So if we take a look here, you can see the green in the back of the orbital sockets of the eyes. That is the sphenoid bone. And then you can see the yellow that's inside the orbital socket on either side. And that is part of the ethmoid bone as it makes its way as part of the nasal passage and creates part of that orbital socket. So those are our cranial bones. Just double checking your list really quick, and I think I've got everything. Perfect. All right, so let's transition then and take a look at the facial bones. They are listed on your screen right now. There are a slew of them, as you can very well see, that are located there. We're going to make our way through each of those. Same way, I'm going to talk through them just on this slide, and then please feel free to make your way through the individual slides to look at specific information about each of those bones. So taking a look at your list of bones that you have there, the first one listed on your screen are the maxillae. The maxillae are your upper jaw bones, and so you have a left and a right. When they don't fuse properly, that's where you end up with that cleft palate situation. So we have a right and a left maxilla forming our upper jaw. If I take my skull and I flip it and I open, I'm going to take a look inside what forms the roof of my mouth. And there are two small bones that form the posterior portion of my what's referred to as the hard palate. The maxillae are forming the anterior portion, and these two small palatine bones are forming the posterior portion, which you can see here. And together they create our roof of our mouth, known as the hard palate. You can also see when I spin us around here, the maxillae are also forming part of our nasal septum and creating part of that nasal passageway, all right? The maxillae runs all the way up even to our orbital sockets. These two small bones that sit right where my glasses are sitting, right on that bridge, those are my two nasal bones forming the bridge of my nasal passage. And then if you look inside that nose, you are going to see a dark gray bone that's kind of flying at you like an arrow, and that's referred to as the vomer. All right, it's a very skinny, long bone, and I am going to flip on the inside here. You can continue to see that gray bone extending out and towards the inferior portion of the skull. And that, again, bone looks like a long arrowhead running through the nasal passage and towards the back of the skull. Within your nasal passageway, you will have those nasal concha that we talked about as part of the ethmoid bone. You'll have a superior portion and a middle portion. And then you can see in what looks like mint green on the side there, you can see the inferior nasal concha. And they kind of look like shells. That's why they're called conch or concha. But again, the first two of them, superior and middle, are actually part of the ethmoid bone themselves. The inferior sits by itself there and is referred to as such. You also have two zygomatic bones that are here in blue, a left and a right. Remember that the cheek or zygomatic bone is going to articulate with the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, forming the zygomatic arch or forming the arch of your cheek. Right? Then we have a couple of small bones that are located here. They're inside the orbital socket there, forming part of the nasal passage wall, as well as part of the orbital or orbit wall. And those are those small pink bones there. And those are referred to as the lacrimal bones. All right, so you have two, one on each orbit. And they're very tiny, small again, forming that bridge of the orbital socket and nasal passageway. Last but not least, you have your very large, essentially detachable bone that is your mandible or your lower jaw. And again, that articulates with the mandibular fossa in the temporal bones on both the left and the right side, forming what we refer to as the TMJ, or the temporal mandibular joint. I am going to just float my way ahead here very quickly, and then do a quick double check and make sure I didn't forget anything, which I think there's only one thing. Perfect, while we're up here. So while I have the jaw there, I'm going to detach this. Because we are identifying the mandibular fossa as a marking, also on the mandible, the part that articulates with the mandibular fossa is called the condylar process. All right, so this is the condylar process with a head of that condylar process that is going to articulate with the temporal bone to form that joint of the jaw. Last but not least, in terms of your list of bones, which I'm pretty sure I am correct on that, yes, is the hyoid bone. The hyoid bone sits around the larynx. That's your voice box, and it serves as a muscular attachment point for various ligaments and various tendons of muscles in your throat. And there is your hyoid bone, and there is where it sits in your neck. It's a bone that you might have heard of if you watch like those criminal shows and somebody was strangled to death. So one of the bones that potentially could fracture due to that strangulation is the hyoid because of its location in the throat area. So that is kind of our wrap up, our quick wrap up of the skull. So providing you with an actual one to look at, as well as going back on your own time, and flipping through the slides to look at some greater and more zoomed in detail. Don't forget to watch the bone animation videos for the skull and the facial bones.